We live in a much more vulnerable world where people's livelihoods are threatened by many, many different forces, environmental threats that come from climate change, for example. At the moment we see a classic example of it in the financial threats, the way in which people's livelihoods in our countries, in the West, in North America, have been suddenly threatened by a sort of a tsunami, a financial tsunami that hit them out of the blue. This is just the latest episode in what's really a global financial crisis. We had many Latin American countries hit by it, Mexico in '94, Brazil in '99, Argentina 2001, 2002. East Asian countries were hit very badly by it in 1997. So this is coming to roost. It's coming back to us to remind us that these are global crises. We're not immune from them. They have a lot to do with globalization, the way in which we're interconnected, and so therefore what happens in one country has impacts on countries far distant from it. That's part of the scary reality of today's globalized world, and that's why we really need to focus in on this vulnerability that affects us and that can suddenly strike, and how to build resilience. This is why resilience is really crucial to policymakers in today's world, to the way in which we all live. We really need to bring this to the fore. So how does one build resilience? Resilience refers to a lot of things. I mean, what makes me resilient? What makes me able to withstand these sudden shocks? One thing is that I have savings, for example. That's a way to make one resilient. That I don't have high levels of debt, obviously, in our current financial crisis. That might help to make one more resilient. But also, my levels of education help to make me more resilient. So spreading education and helping to empower people through education. Others are public policies. Do we have welfare states that really do act as a safety net for people when these crises strike? Or have we eroded the safety nets of the welfare state so that when people are vulnerable they really have nowhere to turn? And that, of course, often is linked to the emergence of new forms of violence as people begin to turn against one another. So that's another form of vulnerability that might emerge. So how do we build forms of resistance that really give us strength to withstand the threats, the growing threats that we face, both in the economic sphere, particularly in the environmental sphere from climate change, and we have huge threats coming down the way. Peak oil, what are we going to do? How are we going to live in a society when oil begins to become so prohibitively expensive that we really can hardly afford to use it? So we need to wean ourselves off these ways of living. That's another dimension of resilience, to have economic policies, to have governments in power that see these things and that plan for them. Not plan just for tomorrow to try to maintain popular support, but plan with a sense of foresight, with a sense of vision. This is why Latin America is very interesting to look at. It suffered a series of financial crises, great vulnerability that affected people's livelihoods in very, very severe ways. But through organisation at local level, through local social movements coming together in country after country and struggling very hard over many years, what has emerged now in the region is governments run by left-wing parties who are aware of these issues and who are seeking, for example, to try to build more resilience through much better funded social services, so that people are not only supported in times of vulnerability, but there's incentives for poor people to maintain their children in education instead of taking them out and sending them to work. All of these are investments for the long term. So from the national level to the local level and then up to the global level, where we develop forms of mechanisms, like, for example, through the Kyoto Protocol, weak and all as it was, but it's something. And what successor now emerges to Kyoto is another example of, at a global level, the attempt to try to put in place policies that will help to build resilience against climate change. Another example is the attempt now to put in place at an international level, through the G20, forms of regulation of the financial system of big banks. Of course, the banks are resisting this, but forms of regulation to ensure that this financial crisis we're suffering from can't happen again, because banks won't be allowed to get away with the crazy speculation that has landed us, I mean ordinary people, with the crisis.